The Formula One calendar doesn't often feature back-to-back race weekends. In fact, it is in fact the exception to the rule, but thankfully this is one of those weeks where we get 2 races in 2 weeks, and I personally am very excited, not only because it means more Formula One action for us as fans, but also because we are returning to Austria. Yes, the Red Bull Ring in Spielberg is one of my favorite circuits, mainly because of the fact that it's very high speed, it's very technical, and it's also not the longest circuit out there. In fact, lap times, generally speaking, will be a little over a minute. But this weekend is even more interesting for numerous reasons, the first of which we're going to get into in this particular preview, where we will look at 5 major talking points ahead of this year's Austrian Grand Prix. Now, the first question that we'll be tackling is this, is that will the sprint race bring excitement? Because of course, as we know, Austria this year is going to be hosting the second sprint weekend of 2022. And obviously the sprint format as such for qualifying, it's been a bit of a mixed bag for the most part. I mean, some people like it, some people think that you shouldn't be tampering with F1's traditional qualifying format, but it is here to stay, at least for a little bit. And Spielberg is one of those tracks where, you know, the potential for a sprint is pretty interesting, because it is not exactly the biggest track in the world. It has 3 DRS zones, so there's plenty of scope for overtaking. And perhaps more importantly, it's not one of those tracks, because of the short nature also of the sprint, you might just end up seeing a few surprises there as well. So the hope, of course, as fans, is that the sprint race will bring in some bit of a change in the order, or it can, you know, throw in something unexpected. Is that going to happen? I think that's probably the first question that will be on the mind of many people. Me personally, I'm hoping that the sprint plays out nicely, because when done right, it can be pretty exciting to watch, and of course a little different from traditional qualifying. But again, this is one of those questions that's only going to be answered as soon as we start the weekend. And of course, you know for a fact that the weekend will be starting. In fact, it's already gotten underway. Free practice has happened. Qualifying is set to happen later today. So the sprint, of course, will happen tomorrow. How that goes, well, we'll see about that. But enough about just the format. Now let's look at the other major questions. The first of them being, is Max Verstappen the favorite going into this weekend? Now again, remember, the last year, that is in 2021, there were 2 races held in Austria. There was the Styrian Grand Prix and the Austrian Grand Prix, because remember, there was a shortage of venues due to COVID concerns. So Austria held 2 races, and Max Verstappen dominated in both of them. Now this year's Red Bull, of course, is the fastest car off the track when it comes to straight line speed, and as I said, 3 DRS zones, so plenty of straights in this circuit. Red Bull most definitely going to be favorites. Also, it's not just the fact that their car is, you know, it has good straight line speed. Their Honda engines are very good at altitudes, and remember, the Spielberg track, there is some hill coverage in and around the area, so they're definitely going to be the favorites. Can anyone stop them? I guess that will depend on the people who I'm going to talk about in my next question, because if you ask me, Red Bull are easily the clear favorites going into this weekend. Remember, even last year, they won the race with ease, and Mercedes were a distant second best. So this year's other team who are competing for the World Championship, well, they're going to have to sort out a few problems if they are going to be posing any threat to this man and his team. And of course, that brings me to the next talking point, is that can Ferrari sort out their issues? Now, of course, when we're talking about Ferrari's issues, it isn't just the fact that they've had reliability issues with their car. It isn't just the fact that, you know, they have sometimes been beaten in terms of strategy, but now it turns out that they have a whole new problem altogether, and that is, who is their number 1 driver? If you watch the British Grand Prix weekend, you could tell that at times there was clearly no real major strategic thinking when it came down to prioritizing that championship contender, who is of course Charles Leclerc. Remember, when the safety car struck in the British Grand Prix, it wasn't Leclerc who was called in, it was Sainz. He went on to claim the victory, whereas Leclerc in the end couldn't even make it onto the podium. So bit of a concern, especially considering that Verstappen was running lower down the order. He only ended up finishing in 7th place. Leclerc could have actually clawed back a huge points deficit if he was allowed to win. So the question Ferrari have to ask themselves, and the question which even we will be wondering about, are they going to make the call and say, yeah, you know what, Leclerc is the guy who's going to be challenging for the championship for us, and we're going to prioritize him over Sainz? Or are you going to have this mantra of letting your 2 drivers race? even at the detriment of potentially ending your team's World Championship run. If they can make a decisive call on that, then it is very possible that Ferrari can at least make up some ground or not lose too much ground to the Red Bulls, all things going very well. The next question, of course, is about Mercedes, and they had a pretty decent showing in the British Grand Prix. Hamilton picked up a podium. Russell was unfortunate to get caught up in that crash, so he had to retire. Not the best of weekends for him, but then a heavily upgraded car did show plenty of promise. Hamilton was looking pretty good, and at one point looked likely to even be challenging for the race win, if not for that late safety car. So that is something that's obviously good if you are a Mercedes fan, but Austria in the recent times has not been a track that Mercedes have done very well in. In fact, their car, as I mentioned earlier in this video, is a distant second best to the Red Bulls last year. And not just that, this time around as well, their car has been struggling in tracks where high downforce is of course the reality of the game. And also remember, the number of straights that are going to be there at Spielberg, there's plenty of scope for their bouncing or porpoising issues to return, even if it's not as severe as it was prior to the Spanish Grand Prix. It's not going to be a very, very good weekend for them, or at least it has the potential to be another weekend of struggle. Will that necessarily be the case? Well, we'll know for sure, but of course, there is a bit of rain predicted in this weekend as well, so anything really is possible. But if we're talking about the teams that are going to be competing against Red Bull, at least on this weekend, my money is on the Ferraris being the closest. Mercedes are again going to be the distant third best team. So again, we will see if I'm right or wrong as the weekend goes on, but let's see. Their cars have generally struggled in tracks which are high downforce and which have slow corners. This particular track in Austria has both of those. So yeah, if I were a Mercedes fan, or I am in fact a Mercedes fan, why am I saying if? I'm going to be prepared for just a little bit of struggle this weekend. And the next question and our final question is, who has the edge in the midfield battle? Because again, this year we've seen a lot more closer racing, which is of course in part thanks to the regulations being designed the way they are, but also there's been a bit of ebb and flow in terms of the way the teams have been doing in recent times. So as you can see, the Alpines of Esteban Ocon and Fernando Alonso, they've been quietly impressive and consistent. Of course, Ocon didn't have a good race last time around, but that was also because he ended up having to retire. But generally speaking, both of them have been in and around the points, and they currently are the 5th best team in the Constructors' Championship, but they're only 6 points behind McLaren, who are in 4th. So if Alpine can, actually make up some ground on McLaren, and remember, both their drivers have been doing well, whereas with McLaren, it's mostly been the Lando Norris show. Daniel Ricciardo has continued to struggle this year. It will make the fight for that all-important spot in the Constructors' Championship even more important. But there are other teams in the fray as well. Remember, the Alfa Romeos have generally been pretty impressive. You cannot discount the Alfa Tauris, because if the Red Bulls are going to do well, you would expect the Alfa Tauris to be following suit. Don't forget, the Williams have heavily upgraded their car as well. And there's also Haas, who might I remind you, ended up getting a double points finish last time around. So again, that midfield battle for me is again going to be something very, very interesting to watch out for. But of course, I can't pick a clear winner just yet. We'll know which of the teams who are adapting better once we are closer to the race. But for me, those are the most interesting things, or the 5 burning questions which I think most teams will be focusing on, or which fans will be interested to get the answers to ahead of this race weekend. Do you think that there's something else that could potentially be an interesting subplot? Do let us know in the comments. And thank you all so much for joining us. If you enjoy what it is that we do, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, drop us a comment as I mentioned before, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Last but not the least, tap the bell icon so you know every single time we're going live or putting up or uploading a new video for your enjoyment. Thank you once again for joining us. As always, I've been Shane Das. I'll be with you guys very soon. Bye-bye for now.